Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. I've been focused on the COVID-19 pandemic since early 2020. I predicted that this was a viral mediated autoimmune disease. I've continued to raise awareness of that because I thought at the time that it was such an important piece of information because it had relevance not just to how we treated disease in the first phase of the pandemic, but also how we can anticipate what can occur when we have done a very broad vaccination campaign across the world. Science is pretty straightforward in that oftentimes, if you can understand the science, you can predict what's likely to happen next. And so, sadly, because of my autoimmune paradigm, I've been able to largely predict almost everything that has happened so far in the pandemic. Sadly, I am predicting as well what is happening about white lung syndrome. This is not for the faint-hearted because what I'm going to say after this is not good. Now, truthfully, this is my opinion. But as I explained to you before, I've been sharing my opinion now for 3.5 years, and largely it has been correct. So this part is really, really significant. And in truth, I am more worried now than I was at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was worried then. There's a presentation that I've got prepared that I haven't done as yet, and this is about the lessons from 1918, pandemic history repeating itself. Now, in that presentation, I'll explain what I think were the mistakes that were made at that time. But very importantly, that pandemic history has a very frightening lesson, and it's about numbers. In the first wave of that pandemic in 1918, there were 2 million who died. In the second wave, it was between 50 to 100 million who died. So that brings us stark contrast into if we've made a similar mistake with this pandemic, we can expect numbers not like 6.5 million, but over 100 million. And this is what I had predicted as well. This was over a year ago, a tsunami of deaths. Now, as I said, this is not for the faint-hearted. This is my opinion. This is not from any of your trusted agencies. This is just me looking at the science and saying, this is concerning. This is serious. We need to figure this out quickly and try and mitigate. That's the important word that I use here, mitigate. Because in truth, in my heart of hearts, I am not looking to stop deaths because I don't think that's possible with what the science is showing. I am hoping to mitigate it. If we can reduce it by 10 or 15%, that's millions, tens of millions of people who could be saved. But it requires serious acknowledgement, serious work by the whole scientific community, not just by me. This is pretty significant. So let's start with some basic stuff. This is in the Daily Mail, and some people don't like the Daily Mail in the UK, but I found the story here, and it's talking about Denmark, the surge in cases in Denmark, white lung syndrome pneumonia sparking fears in China after Netherlands as well warned of alarming spike in cases. So the critical thing that you have to note with this is that this is happening globally. So it's not about a new virus that's causing this. It's not that. It's not that there is some dangerous variant that is driving this white lung syndrome. It's not that. But it's important to note that it is occurring in multiple places at the same time. And what they're finding out is that a lot of it is being driven by Mycoplasma pneumonia, which is a lung infection. And this is the image of the numbers that they are seeing in Denmark. And you can see the rise. This is weeks at the bottom. And you can see this rapid rise in cases over the past 4 to 5 weeks. So this is pretty significant in Denmark as well. So they are looking at declaring a health emergency with regards to what is happening. The problem is that based on the science, This trend is not going to stop. Okay? That's the bit that I think is quite serious. Now, when I made this presentation just a few days ago, I was explaining about the China's mystery wave of childhood pneumonia. I was looking at mycoplasma, and I was looking specifically at how mycoplasma would interact with SARS-CoV-2 to make it the likely predisposing infection in the a co-infection almost with SARS-CoV-2 and Mycoplasma. But the bigger question is, why would Mycoplasma be infecting so many people at the same time? There must be something else going on because it's not just about the viral infection. It is, but it isn't. This is now where it gets pretty serious. And again, everything is predicted. And so I'm going to show you again. This is me predicting this or asking this question. And this was in October 2022. And it was a simple question. Why didn't they develop a vaccine against SARS-CoV? This is the virus in 2003 that impacted Asia. So what was different this time, so to speak? And in effect, when they looked at the study, which I'll come to, they highlighted that all of the vaccine candidates they used at that time triggered a hypersensitivity immune pathology in the lungs. This is the bit that is completely predictable from a scientific point of view. It happened before. Why would it not happen again? So here's the bit that I think people are confused about. And if we had a situation where the vaccine was sterilizing, that means that it blocked infection completely. So it did have an impact on infection, but just not long enough. And in some cases, some would argue that it increased the risk of infection for people who had been vaccinated. Whichever way you take it, it was unable to block transmission. Now, our problem became that once that occurred, we were supposed to face this only once. So, meaning that everybody gets exposed, either they develop hybrid immunity or natural immunity, and then the pandemic is over. Nobody took into consideration that we wouldn't achieve herd immunity. Now, that is our problem because that then takes us back to the study, and the study was doing exactly the question that we are facing now. It's called a challenge study. And so essentially what they did, and so this is the paper here. This was, as I said, this was from 2012. Immunization with SARS coronavirus vaccines leads to pulmonary immunopathology on challenge with the SARS virus. On challenge is the critical word. So what they did, and you can see here, is that they designed 4 vaccine candidates for humans with or without alum adjuvant. And they used a mouse model of SARS and they gave this vaccine to a number of animals, including a whole virus vaccine and a DNA produced S protein. Then they found that when they did that, they got a good immune response. That's great. So, of course, they then go on to do the next step. And so the next step is that on day 0 and 28, they sacrificed for serum antibody measures or challenged with live virus on day 56. So follow this. This is the important piece here. They then took a section of them, of these animals, and they challenged them, challenged with live virus on day 56. On day 58, the challenge mice were sacrificed and the lungs were obtained for virus and histopathology. So that's essentially what they did in 2012. That's good science. That's when you are looking not just for the initial response, but you are looking for the outcomes beyond the initial response. Because getting a good immune response is fine. But the question is, what happens if there is further exposure to the virus? And that's the bit that we needed to take into consideration. Now, some people said it would be endemic and it would be just like a cold. That's low grade infection throughout the population, but it seems to be very significant circulation of SARS-CoV-2 at this stage of the pandemic. And this is what you would therefore call a challenge study. We are now exposing the whole population to virus after a significant percentage has been vaccinated and another percentage has had natural immunity. This is now where we come back to the paper. And the link is in the description if you want to read it for yourself. But I'll highlight here the conclusion. So, in conclusion, all of the SARS-CoV vaccines induced antibody and protection against infection with SARS-CoV. However, challenge of mice given any of the vaccines, any of the four vaccines, led to the occurrence of Th2 type immune pathology, suggesting hypersensitivity to the SARS-CoV components was induced. This was critical, and what they said, caution in proceeding to application of a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine in humans is indicated. That was the science. 2012. And my suspicion is that they hoped this wouldn't happen, which is why mRNA was pushed, because they knew that this was a potential possibility. And I think if you look in the side effect profiles, it is something that is highlighted. They knew it was a possibility, but the hope probably, I am just assuming, the hope was probably that this would not occur. Our problem now is that we don't have herd immunity across the population. The virus is still continuing to circulate. And what we would call this is an example of hypersensitivity pneumonitis, okay? Or extrinsic alveolar, extrinsic, I'll get the correct terminology for it, but extrinsic allergic alveolitis, okay? The kind of disease pattern that was is what we call bird fancier's lung. So that's what would happen in somebody who liked birds, collected birds. They then became sensitive to the droppings from the birds, and they're inhaling it all the time, and they end up with a lung immune pathology because of it. And another example of it is what they call farmer's lung, where because they're dealing with hay all the time, they then become sensitized to the hay. And as they continue to be exposed to this hay, they will then have inflammation in their lungs. So that's an example of hypersensitivity pneumonitis. A similar thing can happen even with air conditioners, what they call humidifier lung. But the point is that you have a trigger, and if you're continually exposed to the trigger, you can then end up with an inflammatory process, an allergic inflammatory process in the lungs. This is a problem because if you, in the early phases of it, it's divided into three phases: the acute phase, and this is what we're seeing in the acute phase. That's the white lung syndrome, most likely, and we'll not know for certain until we start to get histopathology, when they start to take samples of the lung tissue to look at it. But in the first phase, it's acute. If it continues to occur, then they will end up with persistent lung problems, shortness of breath, cough, fatigue. And if that continues to be chronic, 3 months to 6 months, you will end up with lung fibrosis. This is a nightmare. And there are no easy ways out of this, because the first priority is to reduce exposure to the allergen. How in the world can you do that when the population is unable to control a virus that is extremely good at replicating and infecting? Additionally, you may find that vast proportions of the population can't control the virus even when they've been infected. So they are exposing themselves to it all the time. This is an unmitigated disaster. I mean, as I said, this is what you can predict would occur if you have ongoing circulation of virus. And that's exactly what we have at the moment. What do we do? As I said, there are no easy answers. The treatment for hypersensitivity pneumonitis is immunosuppression. You're talking about steroids, which has long term risks. It works in the short term, but the people are continually exposed to this trigger. You could use long term immune suppression, but that comes with risks as well, longer term. And this is across a vast proportion of the population. What can I say? There's no way to fix this. All we can do is try and mitigate it. And mitigation is simply about reducing the amount of damage, not stopping it. Well, the first step is acknowledgement. This should become an absolute priority across the world that we need to get histology of the lungs. We need to get biopsies of these lungs. We need to see if there is an allergic response with eosinophils. We need to understand exactly what is happening. And we probably would have known this if we were doing autopsies, because that's where the answers lie. And we weren't. I mean, as I said, this is an unmitigated disaster, and there are no easy ways out. What can I say? This is not good news, but if there's one thing we've learned in the pandemic is at least be frank with people. Tell them what's going on, tell them your concerns, let them recognize that this is serious, and then we can start to think and plan. How do we manage this? How do we stop the circulation of the virus? How do we reduce the exposure of people? These are all really, really important questions. I hope that this is valuable information for you, but just remember this. As I said at the beginning, the reason why I'm saying this now is that I think the pandemic is repeating itself. I'll cover this story in a little bit, but just remember the numbers. It was 2 million in the first wave, 50 to 100 million in the second. We had 6.5 million in the first wave. What will it be beyond this point? It's frightening to consider. So I'll continue to keep you updated on the science, and we'll continue to watch this space, and we'll see if there are any solutions, and hopefully the scientific community will stop worrying about the politics of mistakes and start focusing on finding answers, understanding pathology, and trying to make a difference. Have a good evening.